You're listening to episode 63 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Artist and educator Brett Cook joins us to speak about art, community building, and contemplative practice as we discuss his book co-authored with Thich Nhat Hanh, Clouds in a Teacup, a mindfulness journey and coloring book. Remember what it was like when you were little in school and it was time for art class. You did finger painting, sculpture, even macaroni art in a group, or at least sitting together with others working on their own projects. What would it be like to have art be a communal mindfulness practice? Brett Cook is an artist and educator who has produced installations, exhibitions, curricula, and events widely across the United States and internationally. His work often involves community workshops and collaborative art, along with music, performance, and food. He has taught at all academic levels in a variety of subjects and has received many awards, and was selected as a cultural ambassador to Nigeria as part of the U.S. Department of State's 2012 Smart Power Initiative, and a Blade of Grass Fellow for Socially Engaged Art in 2014. His work is in private and public collections, including the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, the Walker Art Center, and Harvard University. Brett lives in Oakland, California with his family. Our guest today is Brett Cook. Brett, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so very glad to be having this conversation with you, particularly after observing the video that is embedded in the episode page for this episode and hearing about your work. So I'm very eager to have this conversation. Maybe we can start by having you tell us a little bit about your background.
I was born and raised in San Diego, California by two Catholic public school educators. They I wouldn't think of them as radical people, and yet they exposed me to a lot of different things culturally and personally as a young person, including transcendental meditation when I was 5. So that was one of my early contemplative kind of exposures. And I eventually went to college at Berkeley to study zoology. As a child, I was kind of a prodigy in science and an athlete. So I came to Berkeley to study zoology. And then after, a couple of years of the pre-med track, I started to realize that wasn't going to be my destiny, or I didn't want it to be my destiny. I'd always been very gifted as a person who could make things. I was always the class colorer and the best drawer in school. And so I had taken some art courses and I started thinking I would get my degree in art. So I ran this by my parents, who were both, my dad was assistant superintendent of schools in San Diego. My mother had been a long-term teacher and counselor. And they said, look, son, we love you. We've always said you can be whatever you want to be, and we support you. But you can't be an artist, man. There's just no way you can do that. This is not possible. And so they encouraged me to get a degree in education. So I ended up getting degrees in education and art. But during that time, I was painting things on walls in the middle of the night all over the city. And a lot of them were social in nature, social about relations, political relations, social relations. And part of my attraction to putting them in public space was this understanding that lots of people would see them, that by putting them on walls, lots of people would see them. And so eventually I also started teaching, and I started out my summer jobs. My parents would give me would be elementary school teaching exposures, and then pretty soon I was doing middle school volunteer work, and then high school, and then I taught a year at Berkeley High, and eventually left and moved to New York, and eventually ended up at this really progressive alternative high school in the Lower East Side. And it was, I'd already been in a lot of teaching situations by then, and I had been raised by educators. But it was there that I really got exposed to really kind of progressive pedagogy, and that this was an alternative high school. 99% of the students were on free lunch. It was the last step for them before GEDs. Many of them were in group homes. And yet here was this place where people from Teachers College at Columbia and Bank Street and all these kind of really progressive educational institutions were coming to learn about teaching. And I fell in there to really end up being inspired by looking at ways that teaching could be dialogical.
And I would imagine that fit quite well with your own passion for social change, just in your art in the dark in public spaces.
Exactly. And I think that was and I use that kind of as a runway to talk about one of my teachers, Paulo Freire. And Paulo Freire is this Brazilian educator who really transformed contemporary education. And he has lots of different significant contributions. His book, Pedagogy the Oppressed, is probably the most well-known book that he's written. But for the sake of this conversation, he has a great kind of idea where he talks about true dialogue, whether it's between groups of people or communities, is a praxis or a balance of reflection and action. That if you have only action without reflection, it can be violent. Or conversely, if you have no action and only reflection, it can be inert, like so much of academia. And so that a true dialogue between people or communities is a balance of reflection and action. And so that kind of brings me to sitting into a meditation hall in the early 2000s and listening to Thich Nhat Hanh talk about meditation as reflection and action. That when I'm mindfully walking or mindfully sitting in meditation, I'm reflecting on the act of my footsteps or the act of my breath. And that balance is really reflection and action. And then it made me think about, as an art maker, when I make things, I'm reflecting and acting. That when I'm in the process of drawing something, it may be the material that I'm using or the mark that I'm making or the imagery that's in the image that I'm co-crafting, that I'm really acting and reflecting at the same time.
So you see a deep connection between art and contemplative practice.
Quite literally. And so, by the time I moved to the East Coast in the early 90s, I had already established a pretty prolific, emergent career as a person who did a lot of public work. And soon, by the late 90s, I had literally scores, if not hundreds, of public projects across New York City and across the country. And increasingly, because of my experience as an educator, I was really interested in looking at ways to make the process dialogical and have people not just portrayed in the images that I was making, but both technically and conceptually be involved in their creation.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because that's one of the things that fascinates me about your work is how you see art as a learning opportunity. Talk more about that.
Thank you. I mean, that's part of why I gave some of the intro to the alternative high school satellite, is that it was really in that space that I started to realize that, there's a way of learning that is not simply a banking education model where someone tells another person what to do. They're actually dialogical models where you can have peers or participants generate ideas and outcomes. And really, the art making can be a way to make that learning visible, to really present the ideas and experiences that happen through that relationship of learning in a visible way that can be understood both by the most intimate participants as well as a larger public. And so that those processes started to appear in the work that I was doing in communities. And so I started doing projects where, conceptually I would do things around immigration or gentrification or poetry or history, and actually have residents of different places do what now they're increasingly calling community action research, or ways where the participants in those communities dictate the themes to be investigated, are part of the process of investigating them, and then are actually part of the process of making the objects or the ideas or the new ways of being that are the outcomes of the objects. And one of the ways that I did that is that I started doing these large drawings that people would color. And this is in the late 90s. So some of these would be really large. They'd be, part of huge block parties or festivals with thousands of people. And in addition to all these kind of public pedagogical structures, I'm building these spaces where people could color. And so staying within that idea of both dialogue and meditation and art making being reflections and actions, part of my agenda was making these contemplative exercises in spaces that are accessible. So oftentimes academic institutions or museums, as much as they're quote unquote public spaces, they're not engaged in larger, broader communities. My parents were public school educators. Like I said, my dad, assistant superintendent of schools. We never went to museums growing up. We never really engaged in art. They didn't know anyone who was a professional artist. So really part of my practice has for a long time, not only doing work in communities, but really bringing art, and that kind of expression and that kind of reflection to people in places that don't necessarily go to museums, and using it as an engine to make people's learning visible. And it's also then becomes an engine to, because it's contemplative, bringing people to the present moment and recognizing their interconnectedness. And so the outcomes of these projects might be these really beautiful objects that I help co-create, but they're really reflections of the relationships of the people who made them. And they'll take place in different kind of workshop settings or over course, everything from a day-long experience to multiple weeks or months, or some projects are even years. And so the objects quite literally reflect interconnectedness, and that they're made literally by hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. And then they exist in a public space where everyone has access to them.
That's one of the most amazing things about your work, and what I think distinguishes it for me from other magnificent work of artists is that you're shifting the paradigm a little bit. Instead of it being work that you produce and other people consume, perhaps at arm's length, this is a community effort. You're building not only a mindful practice, you're also building community while educating, because everyone is participating in that.
That's absolutely true. Even though we live in a Western context where arguably, like I use my family, there are many of us that are not close to artists or museums or artistic practices. We still have this kind of unsaid perception about what art is and where it goes. And disproportionately, it's made by an individual expert and lives in a place where precious things go that you can't really touch, that no one's supposed to touch, and really doesn't reflect the complexity of our history or our society. And so part of my practice has been very intentional about redefining and redirecting representation, and doing that by literally having the people make the objects and be the focus of them. So a trajectory that's more common, that as a young person, I really wanted to change the world. I wanted to say that all these things are messed up and let me tell you about it, and they should all change. And then I think I started to realize through years of this practice and including contemplative practices that, if I really want the world to be more peaceful, let me be more peaceful. If I really want the world to be more inclusive, let me make projects that are inclusive. If I really want to see multi-age, multi-gendered, multi-ethnic representations of people in public spaces, let me make projects that look like that, and then that exists in the world. And so there was a kind of radical shift even in my own trajectory, from being this young person who was painting things in the middle of the night about social justice to really modeling the ways of being in a loving community. And obviously that really being built upon a long-term contemplative practice myself.
And let's use that as an opportunity to shift a bit and go into the book. How did this collaborative work between you and Thich Nhat Hanh get started?
So as I mentioned, I was doing these kind of coloring exercises. I started doing them in the 90s. and they vary in kind of methodology and outcomes. But around that same time, I also was doing a lot of research in the more Tibetan traditions of contemplative practice. And I also very much got into yoga. So by the early 2000s, I eventually connected with the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh and started studying with him. And my wife and I were actually part of the international delegation that went with him back to Vietnam after 39 years of exile. And at the time, we were 4 months pregnant. So besides being the youngest people on the tour and being pregnant, we stood out. But it also really endeared us, and it really connected us to that community. So I did a couple projects. I did a project at Deer Park Monastery as a part of a retreat there. There's another book that I did some illustrations for. So for some time, Parallax, the publisher, was thinking, we want you to do a book, because I've done other books about my own educational practice, my community building practice. And they knew that I was a person that was doing all of these kind of coloring methodologies. So we said, why don't we do a coloring book? The thing that attracted me to that was the idea that it could be a way to connect to some of my other projects, what I'll talk about in a minute. But I think for this conversation, it's also interesting. So then about 2 weeks after I started, signed the contract, started doing the drawings, they sent me a link to Huffington Post that said the next new big thing is adult coloring books. And, I do other things besides books. So by the time I finally got the book done, there was literally I think 1,000 new titles of coloring books. And we were fortunate, the publisher was fortunate that when, this wasn't eventually filed in the thousands of coloring books at Barnes and Noble under crafts, it's being filed under spirituality because of Thich Nhat Hanh. But I think it's also being filed that way because the images are actually, many of them come from social projects. So unlike, I think, the bulk of the iconography within this new fad that has been primarily non-figurative, primarily very linear, oftentimes designy or even doodly, many of these images actually come from projects that I've done, that people have colored across the world. This project I did in Nigeria as a part of a State Department project that sent 15 artists to 15 different countries is in there. A project I did at Duke and UNC with 6 different neighborhoods. Project from a high school in Brooklyn. There's an array of images that actually come from that, and they're figurative and they're multi-ethnic and they're multi-aged. And so for me, part of the engine of the book is to actually extend the lives of these projects and help people realize that there's a larger kind of existent practice of people not just coloring to be mindful in the present moment, but using that practice as a way to build community and connect communities and exist in really disparate and diverse locales that I don't think are oftentimes associated both with art making and contemplative practice.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add on to what you just said, Brett, about the style of the art itself. I was just at Barnes & Noble yesterday and looking through the coloring books that they have, and you described it very well. They are either very linear or very designy, and there just seems to be a premeditated antiseptic kind of tone to them. There isn't quite the richness that I would hope for in a coloring book. And yet I see that in the illustrations that you've created in this one. And that brings to it an entirely different tone than other coloring books that you might find it misfiled next to. There's a reason it's put in the section that it is. It is very different than the other ones that are out there.
I'm so grateful for that recognition that you see that. I think it was, like most artists, part of our profession is to be aware of the canon. So, after I got that link, I did some lightweight, research about what the books were being made. And, in addition to trying to use the book to connect to these other projects and communities, I also wanted to use it as a more, as is my expertise, as a way to cultivate people looking deeply. And I think some of the lightweight criticism or what I thought a lot about when I was making it is that I think for many people, the books are an opportunity, or people will describe them as a way to think about nothing, that they're actually, this is so relaxing to think about nothing, to be almost mindlessness. And part of what I was trying to present is really many of the images in my mind are prompts to be added to. They're not completely finished. Some of the drawings are linear and the spaces are closed, and others, they're literally spaces that are left open, or parts of the compositions that are set open, or with the insinuation that the participant is invited to add to it. And so that kind of awareness about the creative decisions for me is part of the mechanism to inspire more mindfulness in the creative practice. That it's not just about mindlessly walking or mindlessly coloring, that these are kind of beginning architectures for creative people to expand from. And in that way, I wrote a relatively expansive appendix about all the images. So the ones that come from actual public projects, to me, are kind of expressions of how potentially big that vision could be contemplatively if you really wanted to make a lot of creative decisions with mindfulness to include people and locations.
Wonderful. Now, in the title, it has that it's a mindfulness journey. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what's the journey part of this book?
Well, I think, that alludes to part of what I was saying, that rather than package or allude to this as a succinct, closed container filled with closed images that are done, the variety of images and the way they are drawn are thought of as more of a practice, a journey. And for me, who is a professional as an educator and art maker, it's been fascinating to watch people color them. So obviously there'll be some people who it's apparent that they have less exposure to color theory or art making, because the way they'll resolve the images may still be pleasant for them, but they're simple compared to other people that have more confidence or experience around coloring and drawing will take the same images and make them really complex. And so even the part of the impetus to have the expansive appendix and have some of these larger pieces accessible for viewers to see is to really see the variety of outcomes that are possible. And not to judge any as good or bad, that wherever you are in that place is fine. But it's kind of analogous to, when people teach art with young people. If you give people a blank piece of paper and say, okay, do some art, a lot of students are like, I don't know what to do. There's not enough structure for me. I don't feel comfortable. That's nerve wracking. I can't do that. So it's much more skillful oftentimes to give a little bit of structure. And then at the same time, in this book, there's an array of that kind of structure. Some of the drawings there's lots of structure and they're easier, and there are others that are really quite complex and abstract, and really are inviting the people to take a journey in their own awareness and let go of their own attachment to maybe some kind of visual outcome and explore other colors or linear outcomes that could be possible.
Wonderful. So what has been the response to the book? What stories can you share?
The publisher was funny. So the book is out, and the first review on Amazon just pans it. It's terrible, man. The drawings are, they're not finished, and I don't know where to color them in, and it's just terrible. I can't believe they did it that way. And then, so the terrible,
didn't include any numbers for them to color by.
So the publisher was terrified. And then subsequently, there have been more reviews that are also true, but also resonate more for me that, this is this really lovely book. Like, even as an object, it's a beautiful object. We made it with a kind of a cover that comes off, so you can actually color the cover of the actual book as well as the images inside. And it's a little bigger than regular size, and the paper's super high quality, all organic, all recycled and fair trade, and natural inks. And so just as an object, it's really beautiful. And now as part of the release of the book, we're showing the original drawings at the DeYoung Museum here in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park. And really, that exhibition, as much as it's about the original drawings that are actually much larger than the book, it's also an opportunity that some of those projects that are in the book are actually on display. So here in San Francisco, one of my most recent projects is they're developing a series of public housing projects here in San Francisco in a one-of-a-kind partnership between these different public entities. And so in conjunction with the Graduate School of Public Health, last year I led an assessment with them and the school around arts and healing in these public housing projects. So did a lit review about public art healing, research around contemplative practices. Then we developed questions, interviewed policymakers, stakeholders, residents, and then did this huge presentation of our findings at the main public library in San Francisco as part of a huge installation that had contemplative art projects that people could make and a big piece that's in the book that people colored and performances. And so then I've kind of polished that piece. And now for the first time, that piece that's a sketch in the coloring book is now, on display in the museum. And I think it's 10 feet high by 12 feet and has all these different media and reflective paper, as well as all of the kind of visual data that came from the assessment, as well as all of the contemplative art experiences that we had in the library. So these things with sketchbooks and clay and drawings, and I have another large drawing from the book. And so part of the exhibition in some ways is like a continuation of the book in that it's, making again these kind of opportunities for people to act and reflect in the present moment to, no matter whether it's in a street with 7,000 people or in a museum with 100, that moment that people go into those drawings and start to color in those spaces become these moments that they're not worried about the past or not thinking about the future, but really being in touch with the present moment. And then also in those spaces, recognizing by doing that in community, there's another kind of realization of our interconnectedness, a realization that is being modeled by the objects that people are making together. But just that feeling that I think for better or worse, we don't really get to practice a lot in our world. We practice a lot more about being separate. You root for the Red Sox, I root for the Yankees, or you ride a 10-steered bike, I ride a one-geared bike, or you speak French and I speak Vietnamese. And so we have a lot of places to practice being separate. And so part of my work, which is reflected in the drawings that we chose for the coloring book, are building these conditions for people to practice being together. And so even the sketchbook, from what I've heard from many of the people who are doing the coloring book, they do those together, that they're doing them with their family or with their friend, or, they're less about these images that you do in an hour and get done real quickly. And it's more about this space that you can go back to numerous times for each image or share with another person. And in that way, I think it is a journey that reflects our interconnectedness.
And Brent, the installation, this is part of a 1-month residency as well?
Yes. So, part of the idea, it kind of dovetails nicely with my own kind of aspirations for my work, is that I've always been interested in art making and art and that creative practice accessible to all kinds of people. And so that's, for me, has kind of manifested in doing projects that always are kind of semi-permeable, going in and outside of the white box of the museum or the gallery, and trying to find ways where they go in and out. So this is a perfect example of here's this project that started in these housing projects and in San Francisco State that involved all these different workshops that always start with contemplative practices, and the images come from these workshops. And now then they go into a library, and then they go into a book, and now they're in the museum. And then actually the images are going to be used back out and magnified as giant public art installations in the actual developments themselves. So there are these very kind of rhizomic ongoing practices, not unlike contemplative practice, which I think is part of why, marrying contemplative practice with my own educational practice and my larger socially engaged art practice has been beneficial, because it's a way for people to, tangibly recognize that the values that are cultivated in being mindful, in being present, in being skillful with our words, in being able to pay attention to our perceptions are actually great skills that are necessary for working together in community. That loving communities are built on those same skills of mindful speech and mindful actions and mindful listening, deep listening, being able to pay attention to other people's contributions. And so in that way, their marriage has, I think, as I've become more seasoned as a practitioner and have embodied those things more in my life, they become more evident in the projects, and the projects subsequently have been much more successful because they've become much more inclusive of the participants and really representative of the participants themselves.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful unfolding and an ongoing journey for yourself and for this way of approaching art and community and openness and inclusivity. For those who want to find out more, you can go to Brett's website at brett-cook.com. And of course, I'll be linking that to the episode page on this episode, as well as several of the books we've talked about today, and especially Clouds and Teacup, a mindfulness journey and coloring book. Our guest today, Brett Cook. Brett, thank you so much for being here.
Such a great honor to be here with you, Ted, and to have your interest in my creative practice and this offering.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.